The courtroom was silent except for the steady hum of the ceiling fans and the scratching of pens as reporters jotted down every detail. At the center of it all sat a man who once wore his police uniform with pride. He had spent years protecting the very city that now stared at him as if he were a stranger. His hands were trembling not because he feared prison, but because he feared losing the trust of his little girl who sat quietly in the back row. People in the courtroom whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others nodded as if the verdict was already written in stone. He was once the officer who caught criminals, who walked into danger when others ran away. He was known in his neighborhood for lending a helping hand to the elderly, for mentoring troubled kids, for being the kind of policeman who still believed in honesty in a world where corruption often paid more than honesty ever could. But now he was here dressed in a plain shirt, handcuffed, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. The prosecutor painted a picture of him that was dark and ugly. They called him a traitor, a man who had crossed the line from law enforcer to lawbreaker. Evidence was placed in front of the jury, documents, testimonies, photographs. To an outsider, it all seemed convincing, but deep down inside, the officer knew none of it was true. Every paper shown, every word spoken had been twisted to fit a story that powerful men wanted the world to believe. He wanted to shout, to stand up and tear apart every false claim, but the system did not give him that chance. His lawyer tried, but against the weight of influence and money, truth alone was too weak. From the witness stand, a man who once worked under him claimed that he saw him commit the crime. The words pierced through him like a knife. He remembered the day he had helped that very same man get out of trouble years ago, covering for him when he made a mistake during duty. Loyalty, he thought, had vanished in the face of fear. That man had been pressured, maybe even threatened, into lying. And yet here in court those lies carried more weight than the years of good service the officer had given. The judge sat tall, face expressionless, as if carved out of stone. He listened carefully, nodded at the right moments, and flipped through pages of the case file. The officer kept hoping. Maybe the judge would see the gaps, maybe someone would realize how impossible it was for him to do what he was accused of. But no one spoke up. No one questioned why certain documents were missing, why an important camera footage had suddenly disappeared. The jury whispered among themselves during breaks. Some avoided looking at the officer altogether, while others looked at him with pity, as though they wanted to believe him but couldn't go against what was laid out on paper. He could see it in their eyes. They were confused, torn between their hearts and the so-called facts. In the back row, his daughter sat with her small hands clenched together. She didn't fully understand everything being said. She was too young to know the language of law, but she understood one thing. Her father was in trouble, and everyone was treating him as if he was a bad man. Every time she saw the guard adjust the handcuffs on his wrists, she blinked hard, holding back tears. She remembered the nights he would come home after long shifts, sometimes with scratches on his arms, but always with a smile, always carrying her favorite snack in his pocket. That was the father she knew, not the man the prosecutor was describing. The trial stretched on for weeks. Each day chipped away at his hope. Neighbors who once waved at him now crossed the street to avoid him. Old friends stayed silent. Some even whispered that maybe he was guilty after all. He could see fear in their eyes too. Fear of standing beside him. Fear of being dragged into his mess. It hurt, but he did not blame them. The ones who had framed him were powerful, and ordinary people just wanted to protect themselves. Finally, the day of the verdict came. The courtroom was packed as if people had come not for justice but for entertainment. The officer stood tall, back straight, refusing to let them see his weakness. But inside, his heart pounded like a drum. He glanced once more at his daughter, who clutched a small stuffed toy she had carried since she was little. That toy had been a gift from him on her birthday, and she always brought it along whenever she was scared. The judge cleared his throat, and silence spread like a wave across the room. The words that followed fell heavy on everyone's ears. Guilty on all counts. Sentenced to years in prison. The officer's head lowered for a brief moment. Not in shame because he knew he had done nothing wrong, but in sorrow. Sorrow for his daughter who would now grow up without him. He heard a gasp from the back, her little voice crying out, "No!" before she buried her face into her hands. That sound cut deeper than any sentence could. He looked at the guards who stepped forward to take him away. In that moment, his heart screamed not for freedom, not for revenge, but for one last chance. One last chance to hold his daughter before they dragged him into a world of bars and cold walls. His lips trembled, and with all the strength left in him, he spoke. "Please, let me hug my daughter. Just once more." The guards hesitated. Rules were strict, and courtroom security rarely allowed such requests. But the room was filled with silence, and in that silence, even the hardest among them felt something stir. They looked at the little girl, tears streaming down her cheeks, and then at the man whose eyes carried more pain than defiance. Finally, one guard nodded. Slowly, they allowed him to walk toward the back row. His chains rattled with every step, echoing through the courtroom like a cruel reminder of his fate. But when he reached her, none of that mattered. She leapt into his arms, wrapping her small hands around his neck, holding him as if she would never let go. He bent down, whispering softly so only she could hear, "I did not do what they say. Don't ever believe it. Be strong, my little one. I'll come back. I promise you." Tears soaked his shirt, and for a brief moment time stood still. Even the prosecutor, who had fought so hard to paint him as guilty, lowered his gaze. The crowd sat frozen, some wiping their own eyes, as the image of a father and daughter burned into their memories. When the guard finally pulled him away, his daughter's cries filled the air. He walked out of the courtroom without looking back, because he knew if he turned around he would never find the strength to leave. His heart carried only one thing now: the memory of that hug, the warmth of his daughter's arms, and the promise that someday, somehow, he would prove his innocence. The courtroom was nearly empty when the guards prepared to take the officer away. The trial had ended and the verdict was final. The judge's words still echoed in his ears. Guilty, sentenced. Years of service, years of sacrifice, years of protecting people. Now all of it reduced to nothing. He stood there, his wrists bound in cold metal handcuffs, but his heart was not thinking about chains or prison walls. His heart was searching for one thing only: his daughter. She sat on the bench at the back of the room, her small hands clutching the edge of the wooden seat, her eyes filled with tears that she was too young to hide. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she understood enough to know that her father was being taken away, and that he wouldn't come home tonight, or tomorrow, or maybe for years. That thought alone broke her fragile little world. The officer's chest tightened as he looked at her. He had faced armed criminals, dangerous streets, and the weight of life and death decisions, but nothing had ever made him feel this helpless. Nothing except the thought of leaving his daughter behind. He knew that once he stepped out of that courtroom in chains, there was no telling when he would see her again, or if he would ever get the chance to hold her in his arms. So, gathering all the courage he had left, he turned to the guard beside him. His voice cracked, but he spoke anyway. "Please," he whispered, "let me hug my daughter. Just once, one last time." The guard shifted uncomfortably. Requests like these weren't part of the routine. Rules were rules, and in a place like this, breaking them wasn't encouraged. Yet something in the officer's voice, something in his trembling eyes, made the guard hesitate. The little girl had already jumped up from her seat, her sobs echoing softly in the silent room. She reached her tiny hands forward, calling out for her father, her voice trembling. "Papa, please don't go." Every eye in the room turned to her. Even the lawyers, who had moments ago been shuffling papers and closing their briefcases, paused in their tracks. The judge, stern and expressionless through the trial, froze for a moment as if struck by something human beneath the robe of authority. The officer's throat burned with emotion. His eyes never left his daughter's face. He felt his knees weaken, not from fear or shame, but from the sheer weight of love and loss colliding inside him. He had been a strong man all his life, but right now he was simply a father who couldn't bear to let go. One of the guards finally sighed, looking at the other. They exchanged a glance, the kind that carried both risk and compassion. Slowly they loosened their grip on his arms. "Make it quick," one of them muttered under his breath. The officer didn't waste a second. He dropped to his knees as his daughter ran into his arms. The chains rattled against his body, but they could not stop the strength of his embrace. He held her close, pressing her head against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair as if it were the last piece of freedom he could carry with him. His daughter clung to him with all her might, her small frame trembling as tears soaked his shirt. "Don't leave me, Papa, please don't go," she cried. His own tears blurred his vision, but he whispered softly into her ear. "Listen to me, my little one. I have to go, but this is not the end. I want you to be strong. I want you to remember that I love you. more than anything in this world. No matter what they say, no matter what happens, I am still your father, and one day I will come back to you. I promise, the words shook inside him. He wasn't sure if promises could survive behind prison walls, but he had to give her something to hold on to when the nights grew too dark, when the silence of his absence felt unbearable. The room had fallen completely silent now. People who had come to witness the fall of a man were now witnessing something else entirely, the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. Even those who had doubted his innocence felt their hearts tighten as they watched. The judge looked down at his desk, tapping a pen nervously. The lawyers shuffled uncomfortably, their professional masks slipping for a moment. Even the guards, usually hardened by routine, turned their eyes away, pretending not to notice their own throats tightening. For those few minutes, time seemed to stop. The officer was no longer a convict, no longer a man in chains. He was simply a father holding his child, breathing her in, memorizing her face, her voice, her touch. Finally, the guard stepped forward again. One of them cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "It's time." The officer nodded, knowing the moment was slipping away. He pressed one last kiss onto his daughter's forehead, his lips trembling against her skin. He whispered again, this time softer, almost like a prayer. "Never stop believing in me. Never forget that I love you." The little girl sobbed as they gently pulled her back, her arms reaching out desperately, her cries filling the air. The officer stood again, his face wet with tears, his shoulders heavy with grief. But there was a strange strength in his eyes now. That hug, that moment had given him something to carry into the darkness ahead. As the guards led him out of the courtroom, people whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, others wiped their eyes, but no one could deny the power of what they had just witnessed. A man condemned by the system had reminded everyone that beyond the verdicts, beyond the accusations, beyond the walls of prison, he was still human, and more than that, he was still a father. That single embrace would not only change him, but it would also plant a seed in the heart of his daughter, a seed of determination that would one day grow stronger than the chains that bound him. The years that followed her father's conviction were not kind. The little girl who had once clung to him in the courtroom had to learn what life felt like without his presence. At first, the emptiness felt unbearable. She would wake up in the middle of the night, calling out for him, expecting him to walk into her room like he always did, ready with a warm smile and a bedtime story. But every time the silence answered her instead. Her heart broke a little more. She remembered his last words, whispered in that trembling but steady voice, telling her to stay strong, to keep believing, and never forget his love. Those words became her anchor. Whenever the weight of the world felt too heavy, she closed her eyes and replayed that moment, his arms around her, the sound of his chains rattling, and his promise that one day he would return. School was hard. Children her age didn't understand. Some whispered behind her back. Others asked cruel questions, repeating what they had overheard from adults. "Your father is a criminal, isn't he?" they would say. Each time her chest burned with anger. She wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, that her father was not what people said he was. But how could she prove it when the whole world had already judged him guilty? She learned to stay quiet, to walk with her head lowered, but deep inside she carried a fire. She told herself again and again, "One day I will prove them wrong. One day I will bring my father back." As she grew older, that fire turned into determination. She started asking questions that others didn't dare to. She wanted to know everything about the case, what evidence was used, who testified against him, and why no one believed his side of the story. At first, people dismissed her. They told her she was too young to understand, that she should move on, that the case was closed and nothing could be done. But she refused to listen. On lonely nights, she would sit with old photographs of her father. In some, he was smiling proudly in his uniform. In others, he was at home, helping her with schoolwork or holding her hand at the park. Each photograph told a story of a man who loved his family, a man who would never commit the crimes he was accused of. She held those pictures like evidence, proof in her heart that the world had been wrong about him. When she became a teenager, she started visiting the library. At first, it was just a place to escape, but soon it became her training ground. She read books about law, justice, and wrongful convictions. She discovered stories of other innocent people who had been imprisoned and later freed. Those stories gave her hope. They told her that it was possible, that even if the world had turned its back on her father, truth still had a chance to win. She also began to look at old newspapers. She searched for every article written about her father's case. She read them carefully over and over again until she knew every line by heart. Something about them didn't sit right with her. The timelines didn't match perfectly. Certain details seemed exaggerated. Witnesses claimed things that felt inconsistent. The more she read, the more questions she had. By the time she entered adulthood, her resolve had hardened. She was no longer just a girl who missed her father. She was a young woman determined to uncover the truth. The promise he had whispered into her ear years ago had become her mission, but it wasn't easy. Every step of the way she faced obstacles. People told her to let it go, to focus on her own life. Some even said she was chasing ghosts, that she was holding on to false hope. But their words only fueled her determination. She knew what she had felt in her father's embrace. She knew the kind of man he was. She couldn't explain it to others, but in her heart, she was certain he had been wrongfully convicted. One evening, as she sat alone at her desk surrounded by papers, clippings, and notes she had scribbled down over the years, she found something that made her pause. It was a court document, one she had read before, but this time she noticed a small detail she hadn't paid attention to. A witness's statement mentioned being at a location that didn't match the official timeline of the case. She cross-checked it with a newspaper report from the same day and her heart raced. The stories didn't align, could it be? Had she stumbled upon something that others had ignored? Her hands trembled as she underlined the inconsistency. For the first time, she had something more than hope. She had a thread, a tiny clue that might unravel the lies that had put her father behind bars. That night, she barely slept. She kept thinking about her father's face, the way he had looked at her in the courtroom, the way he had whispered for her to stay strong. She whispered back into the darkness as if speaking to him through the years. "I won't stop, Papa. I will keep going. I will find the truth." The days that followed were filled with determination. She started to dig deeper, visiting old records offices, requesting documents, and tracking down people who had been connected to the case. Some refused to speak to her, but others, seeing her passion and persistence, offered small pieces of information. Piece by piece, a new picture began to form. She discovered that one of the key witnesses had been under pressure during the trial. Another piece of evidence had mysteriously disappeared, and there were whispers about corruption in the department during those years. All of it pointed toward the possibility that her father had been framed. Every discovery fueled her resolve. She was no longer just chasing hope. She was building a case of her own. Her journey wasn't only about justice for her father. It was also about healing the wound in her own heart. For years, she had carried the pain of being the daughter of a convicted man. Now, with every new piece of truth she uncovered, she felt lighter. She felt as though she was bringing her father back to life piece by piece, even before he could step out of those prison walls. Her story became one of quiet strength. She didn't shout, she didn't demand the world to listen. She simply worked tirelessly, fueled by love and determination. People began to notice. Some were inspired by her persistence, while others still doubted her. But she didn't care about opinions. She cared only about the truth. And deep down, she believed the truth could not be hidden for Eve. Years had passed since the day she had last hugged her father in the courtroom. But her determination had never faded. Now, with every piece of evidence she had collected, every document she had carefully studied, and every inconsistency she had uncovered, she finally felt ready to take the next step. The truth was heavy in her hands, but truth alone was not enough. She needed a way to bring it into the light, to make people listen. For years, no one had believed her. They thought she was clinging to a fantasy, refusing to accept reality. But reality was not what the world saw. Reality was what her father had whispered to her in that one last hug. "Never stop believing in me." With trembling hands, she knocked on the door of a young lawyer who had recently made a name for himself by defending difficult cases. At first, he listened politely, but she could tell from his eyes that he thought it was just another story of a family refusing to accept guilt. Then she opened her bag and laid out the papers she had spent years gathering. Newspaper articles, old police reports, transcripts from the trial, and her own notes that filled dozens of pages. "Look at this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside her. She pointed to a statement in the trial record. "Here, the witness said he saw my father at this place at this exact time, but the newspaper from the same day shows that the road was blocked hours earlier. He couldn't have been there. The lawyer raised his eyebrows. She flipped to another page, pointing again. And here this report mentions evidence collected at the scene. But where is it now? There's no mention of it in the official file. It just disappeared. For the first time, the lawyer leaned forward. He took the papers into his hands, scanning them carefully. The room grew silent except for the sound of pages turning. Finally, he looked up. His expression changed. "This," he said slowly. "This is something." For the first time in years, she felt hope surge through her. Someone finally believed her. Together, they began building a case. It wasn't easy. Every document had to be verified, every missing piece had to be searched for, and every potential witness had to be tracked down. Some doors were slammed in their faces. Some people refused to talk, afraid of reopening old wounds. But others, seeing the determination in her eyes, agreed to speak. Little by little, the walls that had trapped her father began to crack. Finally, the lawyer filed for an appeal. The case, once thought to be sealed forever, was reopened. It sent a ripple through the community. Some were shocked, others skeptical, but everyone was curious. The name of her father returned to the newspapers, this time not as a criminal, but as a man whose story might have been twisted by lies. The day of the hearing arrived. She sat in the courtroom once again, but this time she was no longer a child clutching the edge of a wooden bench. She was a young woman, standing tall, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. Her father was led in, older now, his hair streaked with gray, his body thinner than she remembered, but his eyes still carried that familiar strength. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod. It was a silent thank you, a silent "I'm proud of you." The proceedings began. The lawyer stood and presented the evidence. His voice was clear, his words sharp, but it was the truth itself that carried the weight. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the original testimony. He showed how one witness's account directly contradicted physical evidence. He revealed documents that had been hidden during the first trial. And most shocking of all, he exposed the corruption that had existed within the department at the time. Corruption that had every reason to silence a man like her father. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. People who had once believed without question now found themselves doubting. Could it be true? Had the man they condemned been innocent all along? The prosecution tried to fight back, but their words stumbled. Their witnesses, once so confident, faltered under cross-examination. One even admitted that he had been pressured to testify a certain way. Gasps filled the room. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the growing possibility that a terrible mistake had been made. She sat on the edge of her seat, her hands clenched tightly together. Her heart raced with every word spoken. She looked at her father, watching as hope flickered in his eyes, hope he had buried for so many years. Hours felt like days, but finally, after long arguments and endless presentations, the courtroom fell silent. The judge shuffled his papers, adjusted his glasses, and looked out at everyone. His voice was calm, but every word seemed to strike the air with thunder. After reviewing the new evidence, and after hearing the testimonies presented in this appeal, this court finds that the original conviction cannot stand. A gasp echoed through the room. The judge continued, his voice steady. The accused is hereby declared innocent. The court acknowledges that a grave mistake was made. This man is free. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She couldn't breathe. Tears filled her eyes, blurring her vision, but she didn't care. She turned to her father, who sat frozen, disbelief written on his face. Slowly, as the words sank in, his lips trembled and tears rolled down his cheeks. She stood, her legs weak but her spirit soaring. The guards removed his chains, the sound of metal falling away like the breaking of a curse. He stood, shaky but proud, his eyes locked on his daughter. The room erupted in noise, some clapping, some crying, others whispering in shock. But none of it mattered to them. The only thing that mattered was that after all these years, after all the pain, the truth had finally come out. He walked toward her, each step heavy with the weight of years lost, but lightened by the freedom now returned. When he reached her, she didn't hesitate. She ran into his arms just like she had as a child. But this time there were no chains, no guards pulling them apart. Just father and daughter, finally free to hold each other. The hug was long, filled with all the words they couldn't say, all the tears they couldn't shed, and all the years they couldn't share. Around them, people watched, many with tears in their own eyes, realizing they were witnessing something rare, the power of love. faith and truth breaking through injustice. For him, it was more than freedom. It was proof that his daughter had never given up, that her determination had carried him through the darkness. For her, it was the moment she had dreamed of every night since that last hug in the courtroom, the moment she could finally keep her promise to herself, to bring her father home. As they stepped out of the courtroom together, the sun felt warmer, the air fresher, as if the world itself was welcoming him back. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but neither of them paid attention. They walked side by side, hand in hand, their bond stronger than ever. What had once been a story of despair was now a story of hope. What had once been an ending was now a beginning. And though the scars of the past could never fully disappear, they knew one thing for certain. The truth had finally won. The heavy doors of the courthouse opened, and for the first time in many years he walked out not as a prisoner, not as a man in chains, but as a free human being. The sun touched his face gently, as if it had been waiting all this time to welcome him back. He stopped for a moment on the steps, breathing in the fresh air deeply, almost in disbelief. After years of walls, bars, and silence, the sound of the city, the chatter of people, and the warmth of the open sky felt like a dream. Beside him, his daughter stood tall, her hand wrapped firmly around his. She had imagined this day for so long, and now that it had finally come, she couldn't hold back her tears. The years of struggle, the long nights of loneliness, the endless fight for justice, all of it had led to this moment. And now her father was free. Crowds had gathered outside waiting for him. Some were reporters eager to capture every detail of this unbelievable turn of events. Others were strangers who had followed the story, curious or moved by what had happened. But in that moment, he didn't hear their questions or see their cameras. His world had narrowed down to one thing: his daughter's face. She looked at him with eyes full of love, pride, and relief, and he looked at her with gratitude so deep that words could never express it. Slowly, he reached out, placing his hand gently on her cheek, as if to make sure she was real, as if to remind himself that this was not another dream that would vanish when he woke up. For a moment, silence surrounded them, even with the noise of the crowd. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms. It was a hug unlike any other. Years ago, he had begged for one last embrace in a courtroom, believing it might be the final one he would ever have. But this hug was different. There were no guards to pull them apart, no chains to hold him back. This time, he was free to hold her as tightly as he wanted, and he did. His arms wrapped around her, his body trembling with emotions too big for words. She held him just as tightly, her face pressed against his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. "I told you, Papa," she whispered through her sobs. "I told you I'd bring you back." He closed his eyes, his tears falling freely now. "And you did," he whispered back. "You never gave up on me. You gave me back my life." The people around them watched, many with tears in their own eyes. Even the reporters who had come searching for a story found themselves moved by the raw humanity of the moment. They had seen many trials, many verdicts, many headlines, but this was different. This was not just about a man proven innocent. It was about the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. As they finally pulled back from the hug, both of them wiped their tears but couldn't stop smiling. It was the kind of smile that only comes after years of pain, the kind of smile that holds gratitude, relief, and love all at once. Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand. Each step felt like victory. Each breath felt like freedom. The world was watching, but for them it was only about each other. They didn't care what the newspapers would write the next morning, or what the reporters would say on the evening news. What mattered was that after all the darkness, they had reached the light. That evening, they sat together in the small home that had once felt empty without him. Now the rooms echoed with laughter again. He looked around slowly, touching the familiar walls, the furniture, the photographs on the shelf. Everything seemed the same, yet everything felt different. His daughter sat across from him, watching him quietly. She could see how much he had aged in prison, how the years had left their mark on his face, but she also saw the strength in his eyes, the warmth in his smile, the same father she had always believed in. "Do you know," he said softly, breaking the silence, "that it was your hug that kept me alive in there?" She frowned gently. "What do you mean?" "That day in the courtroom," he explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "When they let me hold you one last time, I thought it was the end. I thought I'd never see you again. But that hug, it gave me something to hold on to. Every time I felt like giving up, I closed my eyes and remembered the way you clung to me, the way you cried for me. It gave me the strength to keep going. Her eyes filled with tears again. She had carried his words in her heart all these years. But now she realized he had carried hers too. That one hug, that desperate embrace, had been the thread that kept them both connected through all the years apart. And now, he continued, smiling through his tears, here we are, free, together. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. We made it, Papa. We really made it. The night passed with stories, laughter, and tears. They talked about the years they had lost, the pain they had endured, and the hope that had carried them through. For the first time in a long time, they could dream about the future without fear. The next morning, the story of his release spread across the nation. Headlines spoke about the wrongful conviction, the appeal, and the shocking truth that had set him free. But more than the facts, what people remembered was the image of a father and daughter embracing outside the courthouse. That image touched hearts everywhere. It became a symbol of hope, proof that love and truth could outlast even the darkest injustice. People wrote letters, sent messages, and even came to meet them. Some shared their own stories of injustice. Others simply wanted to say they were inspired. For the first time, their pain had become something bigger, something that gave strength to others. But for them, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about the simple things they had once lost and now regained. It was about sharing meals together, walking side by side and knowing that tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, they would be together. The years of separation had left scars. Yes, but those scars only made their bond stronger. They had faced the worst and survived. And now, every hug, every smile, every laugh felt like a gift. One evening, as they sat quietly watching the sunset, he turned to his daughter and said, Do you realize what happened? The hug I begged for in the courtroom, the one I thought was the last. It became the hug that changed everything. That moment gave you the strength to fight for me. And now here we are, hugging again as free people. She leaned against his shoulder, smiling through her tears. Maybe that's what love is, Papa. It doesn't end, no matter what happens. It waits, it fights, and it always finds its way back. And in that quiet moment, they both knew the truth. The world had tried to break them, but love had kept them whole. The system had stolen years from them, but it could not steal their bond. Their story was no longer just about a wrongful conviction. It was about a father and daughter who refused to let go of each other. And in the end, that love had shocked everyone, not because it was rare, but because it was powerful enough to change everything.